Swinson.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, 8 years ago, this House discussed intervention in Iraq. At that time, I was not a member of this House. Instead, I was marching on the streets of Glasgow against that war, along with more than 1 million other people across the United Kingdom. And I deeply regret not just the UK's role in Iraq, but the legacy that that has left for UK foreign policy. As the Honourable Gentleman for Keighley so eloquently pointed out, it has undoubtedly made the role of our diplomats much harder in the negotiations they face with other countries and diplomats around the world. It has undermined much of what they do, and it has understandably made both the government and the British public more sensitive about any UK military action, even within the context of United Nations support. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, Libya is no Iraq. The two are worlds apart. Not only is international action in this case legally justified, I believe it is morally right to act to protect Libyan civilians. The situation is very different. In Libya, the people are demanding action. The regional neighbours are in support, and indeed the Arab League request for help is highly significant. I will give it.
Isn't it important for us not to pigeonhole the support from the Council League of Arab States, because their decision on the 12th of March not only was a decision to call for a no-fly zone to be imposed, but also, crucially, to establish, I quote, safe areas in places exposed to shelling as a precautionary measure that allows the protection of Libyan people and foreign nationals residing in Libya. Doesn't that provide the important basis for the UN Resolution 1973 to take all necessary measures, including, indeed, bombardment to protect civilians?
Indeed, the Honourable Gentleman is quite right, and indeed the Arab League was also clear about not wanting a foreign invasion force, which is also importantly explicitly outlined in UN Security Council Resolution 1973. We have, as has been discussed already, the new principle which is developing within the international community of the United Nations responsibility to protect, which is something that wasn't in place 8 years ago, and indeed I believe would not in any way have applied to the situation in Iraq either. And it is hugely positive, I believe, that the Security Council is prepared to take action under responsibility to protect, to actually make it a meaningful concept and not just warm words. And indeed, turning to the resolution itself, I think it is incredibly helpful that the scope is not just about a narrow no-fly zone, but it does represent taking all necessary measures to protect civilians and civilian-populated areas under threat of attack, and indeed excluding explicitly a foreign occupation force of any form on any part of Libyan territory. But today, this is the most serious type of decision that this House can ever be asked to take, and it is vitally important that we are well aware of the risks, and there are many risks to this action. Obviously, the risks to our forces and those of other countries when carrying out this action. Now, of course, we take action in terms of the air defences of Libya to try to minimise those risks, but those risks are always there, and we, in the safety and security of this House, owe a huge amount to those troops that we ask to take action in the name of the United Kingdom and indeed of the United Nations, and we commend their bravery. Now, there may have been a feeling of optimism in Libya as the news came through about the United Nations Security Council resolution, but the scenario where Gaddafi concludes the game is up and the Libyan pro-democracy campaigners celebrate some smooth transition to a free society might be a welcome fantasy, but it is just that. It's hardly likely to be the outcome. Even if Gaddafi were to go, the building of a democracy is far from easy. And as is more likely, if he does not, then we're looking at a situation where the end game is not necessarily clear, and we may end up in a stalemate situation. There is a further risk also if we do not have a swift conclusion, nor a clear path to a specific end point, that there will be increasing pressure on the international coalition, and it will be difficult to hold together that consensus that we have now. Indeed, as has been pointed out, it is already not perhaps as firm as it was initially. And of course, there is the risk that Gaddafi will use the no-fly zone being implemented in terms of propaganda, trying to paint the picture of the West being imperialist and imposing on the Middle East. And from a United Kingdom perspective, where we have forces already overstretched in Afghanistan, we may not be easily able to respond in terms of military might to any of the developments which might require a further response. So we absolutely need to have our eyes open when considering voting on this motion this evening. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, not acting is not a neutral position to take. There are huge risks of inaction also, not least the bloodbath in Benghazi. Indeed, in Gaddafi's own chilling words, we heard exactly what would have happened, that he would give no mercy. We will track them down and search for them alley by alley, road by road, house by house. And in making that broadcast on the Libyan media, it was very clear that his aim was also to terrorise his own people, to make them cower into submission. As I raised last week in Prime Minister's questions, of course, we have to also consider the risk of the message that we would be sending to other oppressive regimes around the world, that they can do whatever they like, that under no circumstances will the international community act. Because actually, what other circumstances would we act when we have, in this situation, we have regional consensus about it, we have the public demanding it, we have the clear legal position. If we do not act in this circumstance, then I put it to the House, what circumstance would we act under? And then what about the message to other oppressed populations? We have seen the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt and now in Libya. And I'm sure around the rest of the world people are watching. If we were not to act, the message we would send would be that if populations do assert themselves and demand their rights and then ask the international community for help when peaceful protest is met with murder, that their request for help would fall on deaf ears in terms of the international response. What hope in that circumstance could any population have? We would also run the risk, if we do not act, of turning Libya into an isolated pariah state, where actually Gaddafi would have nothing to lose and would be even more dangerous than before, somewhat like a wounded animal. And we run the risk that in some months from now we would be repeating the hand-wringing that the international community collectively did after the massacres in Rwanda. So it's not an easy decision for this House to take. It is not something which we should do lightly, and indeed it is one of the gravest decisions that we will ever be asked to take as members of this House. It is absolutely right that we scrutinise the detail, but I believe the House will come to the right conclusion. Action to protect Libyan civilians struggling for democracy is internationally supported, legally justified and morally right.
Well done.